I'm Frank Balla from Georgetown University. In addition to thanking all the speakers, particularly the ones who travel the greater distance, but also thanks to Julia, who stood in for Andre. We really greatly appreciate that. I'd like to thank, first of all, Sergey and Sciences Po for all this and the tremendous hospitality. I mean, I think they've done a tremendous job in getting everything ready and organising this tremendous conference. I'd like to, there's particular people that I'd also like to thank. I'd like to thank Inga. I won't try to pronounce your second name, for doing a huge amount of work. There's a round of applause. It's been a major production to organise all these things, and she's done a terrific job. I'd also like to thank, there's also people at Georgetown, Mary Gordon and Julia Murillo, who has also done a huge amount of work organising everything. Nate, I'm going to thank you again while you're still awake. So if you fall asleep, when I thank you next time, you acknowledge it. I want to thank Matt. Thanks very much, Matt, for your presentation, but also for participating. So now I'd like to get on to the next speaker. We've got 45 minutes. I should have deferred to Sergey to pronounce all the names. All I'm going to do is say that Katerina is going to be the next speaker. And so thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for organizing this, and thanks for the invitation. This is joint work with Sergey Guriev, American Re, and Theo Marquise, and Sergey is right here. And the title is Stop False Circulate True: The Impact of Anti-Misinformation Policies on Social Media. And we will start with the following observation. So I'm going to focus on one particular aspect of social media, which is that it sometimes is used to spread disinformation. And would like to motivate this with essentially an obvious observation, which is that disinformation, particularly on social media, is or seems to be a major political issue. And, just to get into the frame, let's think about what it could do. It could distort political outcomes, and we could think about examples of that. It could cause political turmoil, even think about the Stop the Steal. It could instigate hate crimes and even, contribute to systemic health risks when people stop believing in vaccines, for example. So the questions are, what are the policy solutions for that particular problem? And there are several on the table. There's a public debate. There is, of course, some issues on how we could possibly regulate and whether we should regulate social media, whether we should fine them for disseminating fake news, whether we could massively use digital literacy campaigns in order to limit the impact of dissemination of false news. We also could think of some shorter term interventions, and in fact they could be done through top-down regulation, but also some of it could be adopted by social media platforms because of the social pressure on them. Think about fact-checking, which is somewhat been, although too little and too late, introduced by Facebook and Twitter and some other social media. We could also think about, let's say, adding some costs, particularly confirmation clicks, both to access some content which is in some ways socially harmful, or to share it, and Twitter has done some of that. We can also think of other possible interventions like nudges, like basically telling people that some of the content, if they share it, may have high social costs. And generally, there's a growing literature to which some of the people in the room, including us, have contributed to, which tries to study the effects of these interventions. And the important thing that our reading over this literature is basically that these papers typically focus on one policy at a time, set in a different setting, which doesn't really allow us to compare different policies. It also mostly, in this particular literature, mostly sort of reduced form, which doesn't really allow us to try to unpack what's going on and extrapolate for different contexts. Also, what is important, and that's important for policy, so far we have very little evidence how these all interventions affect the circulation of true news. And that's, of course, important for the overall effects. And to us, the essential missing piece of the puzzle when we read all of this literature is we really want to understand how these interventions affect utility of sharing. So in other words, what's behind the reduced effect of these policies on the actual outcomes. And so what we do in this paper, we try to fill in that gap by doing two exercises. First, we just do a randomized survey experiment with real Twitter users, where we try to estimate the impact of several different interventions in the same setting, and also look at both sharing true and false news at the same time, and we're going to compare the effects on both. And then we're going to try to understand how the reduced form effects are played out by thinking about of what drives sharing. So we're going to build a model of sharing decision on sharing of misinformation, political information on social media, and we're going to essentially unpack the effects of different interventions on several channels through which these interventions can affect sharing decisions. The first one is just individual assessment of content. Think about, let's say, fact checking. Presumably, it could affect the beliefs of people about the content they share, whether it's true or not. It could also be the relative weight of, let's say, reputation and persuasion motives in actual decision to share some information. In other words, think about a nudge. If I am told that it's really, really bad to share misinformation, even if it's, for example, politically makes sense to me to persuade others, I would be more wary of doing this. And finally, we're going to look at the overall costs of sharing, because each of these interventions actually creates frictions. So it could be either just simple time frictions when you need to click more, or it could be sort of intellectual frictions when we are asked to think about what we are doing. So all of these are important, and they may play out very differently. And what we're going to do is we're going to simulate the contribution of each of these three channels, or in order to understand how the different policy interventions affect the decisions. And hopefully I'm going to convince you that we actually find some non-trivial effects there. Let me skip some of the things to get to the essence and introduce our experiment. So the most important feature of our experiment is probably that it's about real sharing decisions on Twitter. And it is in a real high stake, relatively high stake political context. So this was staged during the campaign for the midterm elections in 2022. We draw online a sample of US voters of 3,500 people, and we access them online through an online platform, which is used for surveys. And the experiment actually has a few building blocks. First, of course, as everybody else, we collect a lot of pre-treatment characteristics to try to understand who are we dealing with. Then participants are given actually the set of political content available on Twitter. Then we randomize them into several interventions. I'm going to tell you what they are in a second. And after that, participants can decide whether to share that content on Twitter or not. And finally, we also ask them to assess what do they think about this political content, which they just saw or maybe shared. So let me go through each parts very, very briefly of our experiment to get to the structural estimation side part afterwards. So what kind of tweets they saw? The participants were presented 4 tweets sequentially in random order, and they were just given a screenshot of them, and it turns out that it's exactly the same as Twitter, and they were able to check whether this is the case or not. Half of them did. And these tweets were posted on an account, which essentially is a bot news aggregator we created for it. It was called 2022 Political News, and that account posted news from liberal and conservative media every 4 hours. And we took the set of most popular, most sort of prominent media from the previous work of George Tucker, and the bot basically every increment of 3 hours posted the 4 most read conservative news and 4 most read liberal news. Importantly, we didn't, that's without replacement, so that we don't have repetition of it. The account was up and running when we started the experiment, so that's how it looked, and the participants verified that this was the case. So what kind of tweets these were? So there were 2 true tweets with the correct information, and 2 tweets with false information. The false information tweets didn't come from our aggregator. We actually picked them from the PolityFact fact-checking platform and planted into our bot account manually. So one was on social issue, the other was on economic issue. And as far as the 2 true tweets, we actually picked them among those which were picked by our algorithm on somewhat similar issues. And one came from Republican media, the other came from Democratic media. So just to give you the tweets, so the first true tweet was that Biden administration has opened the application process for Americans seeking student debt relief. The other true tweet on cultural issue was Florida schools ordered to provide bathrooms separated by biological sex. And of course, you can all understand which one is democratically, which one is republicly leaning. And as far as the false tweets are concerned, there were 2. So one was about Biden aiding more IRS agents to investigate taxes than there are detectives investigating crime. And the picture basically shows how many. And the final false tweet was about Supreme Court voting to ban condoms. So these tweets were shown to our participants, and then after being treated, I'm going to tell you how, they were asked if they want to share any of that. On real Twitter, they could choose not to share anything or pick one tweet out of these to share through our platform. Of course, they had access to Twitter, so they could share other things, without our control. Then they were brought to another screen to confirm. So what kind of treatments we randomize the participants into? So there were 5 different treatment groups. One is with quote unquote no policy. In other words, after being shown tweets, people just were asked whether they want to share them. So then there were 4 different policies: require extra click, prime fake news circulation, offer fact check, and ask to assess content before sharing. I'm going to tell you very quickly what they are in a second. I just want to right away say that randomization worked. So there's balance. We can basically immediately see what the reduced form results of these are. So with requiring extra click, there's just basically, it's introducing yet another friction, yet another screen and click before they can actually get to sharing. Yes, Michael. So this is about the decision of sharing a particular tweet. They decide they want to share. After that, they had to reconfirm again compared to others who weren't in that treatment. That's independently, absolutely, yes. So then the other treatment was priming false news circulation. So here we used the wording of political scientists who studied that intervention before, which is essentially, please think carefully before retweeting. Remember that there are a lot of false news circulating on social media. And again, this is for everybody, for any desire to share any tweet. As far as offering fact check is concerned, here, as you can imagine, we try to emulate the real life let's say, experiences where we rarely have fact-checking of true information. That's why, as far as offering fact-check treatment, we were telling our respondents that there are 2 out of 4 which were fact-checked. And of course, those are those happen to be false, but we haven't told them this. And we asked them if they want to see whether this information is true or not. Interestingly, so quite a large number of them said yes. 42 verified the tweet on IRS agents for 42% and 55% on banning condoms. So the other part of our experiment is we ask our participants to assess the content, assess each of these tweets. And particularly in two aspects. One is we wanted to see what they think about the veracity of the content. We basically asked them to guess the probability that this content, this tweet is true, and partisanship. We asked them to, on a scale from 1 to 5, whether they think that it favors Democrats or Republicans, provide if that content is true. It's probably worth noting that all responses were incentivized and the participants understood that this is the case. And everybody, apart from one treatment group, got that at the very end of our experiment, whereas the treatment, which we refer to as ask to assess tweets, did the evaluations before sharing decisions. So they thought about what the content they're sharing much more than others. Interestingly, so we see that participants are actually quite good at differentiating true from false content, and that's what we could see on the left-hand side chart here. They also are pretty good at assessing partisan leaning of true tweets. So those who, excuse me, those who came from democratic media, they were deemed to be pro-democratic, and those which came from Republican media were deemed pro-Republican. So with that, let me just go directly excuse me, to the reduced form results and show you what these very simple interventions do to the aggregate sharing within our experiments. So what this slide shows is two bar charts. The left bar chart shows the effect of the treatments on false tweets, on sharing false tweets, and right-hand side chart on sharing true tweets. And we, as you can see already, sorted the interventions according to their effect on sharing false information. We see that requiring extra trick has already significant but small effect, and then much larger effect is for prime fake news circulation, offering fact check and asking to assess tweets. Interestingly, so the effects are very different in the reduced form for true tweets. In particular, only two interventions, the prime fake news circulation and offering fact check, have an effect, and these have effect in opposite direction. So priming false news circulation actually increases the sharing of true tweets, and offering fact check decreases it. And remember that offering fact check doesn't mean that people actually used it. And also there was a fact check only for subset of the political information provided. So let me just keep in mind these reduced form effects, and I would like to just very, very quickly go through our structural model. I will just, basically outline it very, very in brush strokes, and then explain why do we need it. So just to preview, I would like to say that what we try to do, and that's the main part of our research, is try to unpack, try to understand what these results are and why are the way they are. So in order to do that, we try to think about what drives decision of sharing. So think about a very simple setup in which there is a state of the world, which could be sort of pro-Democrat or pro-Republican, meaning that when the state of the world is pro-Democrat, the democratic action or policy is optimal, whereas when the state is pro-Republican, it's Republican action, which is optimal. Then there is some content available online, and there is so far one sender, but we're going to generalize it at some point, hopefully, who is thinking of sharing something, some of this content on social media, or not sharing anything. And the reasons for him to share are that by doing that, that he could pass on a signal to the consumers of social media about the state of the world. And the reason why that sender is interested in this is because, you know, the actions of these recipients of this information are important for his welfare. So there is a partisan persuasion payoff from sharing something on social media. At the same time, there is a reputation payoff because these people who send something, they actually want to appear as informed. And here is, yeah, Matt, absolutely right. Yeah, so the question by Matt was that there could be a potential other motive, which is maintaining reputation or signaling your partisanship to the outside world, which is a very good point. We were thinking about this. This model so far is abstracting from that, but we have already have some idea of how we can introduce that. However, everything which I'm going to tell you about these two particular motives are still going to be true in this more complicated model. But maybe at some point when I'm going to get to that, I'll tell you what it would do. Okay, so I apologize right away. I was told that this is purely academic workshop, so I could put some formulas on the slides. But let me just tell you that sort of people, the senders, and sort of each pair of sender and content has characteristics. What are these? These are two. One is veracity. In other words, how the sender perceives himself or herself, whether what he potentially or she potentially can share is true or not. That's the first thing. The second thing is partisan alignment. In other words, the people themselves have some priors about, or some beliefs about the state of the world. They want to pass it on, and they know that the potential information could signal that state of the world or the other. So partisan alignment is when they go in the same direction. There's also another part of the story, which is that everybody, all actors in this model can be informed or not informed. And informed individuals really observe everything, all the information. So now just 2 words about the payoffs. So the receivers of the information take just one action denoted by AK. Think about this is political action. So it could be resharing content, voting, donating, and it all depends on the receiver's belief about the state of the world. And the optimal action for the receiver is to just make the action congruent as possible to his or her belief about the state of the world. So when the receiver or when the sender sends this information, decides whether to send or not, of course the sender understands this and he wants to persuade the receiver that the true state of the world just as he or she thinks what it is. And that leads us to this very, very simple utility function, which we can write down, which says that, okay, there is a partisan persuasion and reputation payoff. Of course, leaving aside for now the Matt's point on signaling partisanship. We solve that model, we get an equilibrium, which is actually quite intuitive, which tells us that sharing decision monotonically depends on partisan alignment, but differentially so, depending on whether senders are informed and not informed and whether the messages are true or false. In particular, if a sender is informed and content is false, then you need the message needs to be very partisan for the person to pass it on. Of course, that will be different if there is also a signaling of partisanship effect, because sometimes people would forego some of the reputation of being informed in order to signal that they're partisan, but for now we abstract from that. So overall, let me just skip over this and come to the interesting, sort of for us, interesting observation, which is useful to estimate this model, is that actually in equilibrium, we can write down the utility of the sender of content J as this kind of equation, which looks surprisingly as a regression equation, if you like. So what is it? It tells you that the utility, sort of the reputation payoff, increases in perceived veracity of the content, and the persuasion payoff also increases, but in partisanship, or partisan alignment, I should say, of the content, and more so if the news is likely to be true or perceived as true by the sender. So, and we are going to use that specification in order to try to understand what's happening in the real data. There's quite a lot of technical details here, which I'm going to skip, but the point is that you can think about the two different decisions which are sort of nested one in the other. One is to just generally whether I share anything on social media, and the other is provided that I share something, I share a particular content. And that allows us to think about sort of two very, very different aspects of the effects of treatment. So one aspect is on introducing costs of sharing. The other is how different treatments affect these different motives of the senders. In particular, yes. Yeah, so not quite. Why? Because what you okay, so yeah, I will need to go back to our sort of extended model to really think it through. But the point is that usually the signaling and the way we thought about it. So let's say the signaling would be yeah. So look, it's so. Yeah, so as far as the interaction on alpha-3, that would be negative prediction. But actually, there could be another aspect, or which is useful in decomposing these two ways to think about it, which would be how viral these messages are, and we have abstracted from them completely. Look, so. Indeed, so I think Sergey is absolutely right that if we had signaling effect, then alpha-3 may be negative. Although, you know, for now in our estimation it is positive. However, we could try to complicate this model a little bit. So I will, okay. Stepping back again, this is work in progress. We're still trying to think about it. So all your comments are very, very useful. So I will need to think about it even more, obviously. So now coming to the actual sort of application of this theoretical model to our experiment and to the data, the way we think about it is the following, that treatments can affect actually what we see as far as outcome of sharing through three different channels. One is that individual estimates of the characteristics of the content may change, like veracity and partisan alignment. There could be the effect on salience, in other words, on the weight of the reputational concerns relative to persuasion motives in the utility function. So this is purely behavioral effect, where I'm more or less aware of the reputation concerns when I decide to pass on information on social media, and just pure costs of sharing the effect. And we can actually recover each of them by estimating the full model, and we do it basically step by step. We first look at what's happening among those who decide to share, depending on the estimates of veracity, alignment, and interaction of it, where we see that all coefficients are positive and fairly robust, and we can from then recover the relative weights of the reputation motive, and we see that especially priming false news circulation and offering fact check actually has quite a large effect on changing these relative importance of reputation information. So then, using this estimation, we can actually calculate what is the utility from sharing content, provided that people decide to share, and then plug it in to try to understand whether they would opt not to share. And that's what's done in this estimation, where after we see the effect of the inclusive utility, we see the additive effect of treatments, and we interpret that as the differential effect of treatments on different frictions between you and actually, sharing something on social media. So, and what we see here is that offering fact check and ask to assess tweets are particularly costly. And that's not surprising, because not only it requires clicking, it also requires thinking about what you are doing. Finally, and I'm gonna get to the conclusions after that. Finally, the third important channel is whether, or potentially important channel, theoretically important channel, is whether the interventions actually affect people's perceptions about the actual content which they may or may not share, particularly whether the veracity and alignment estimates are affected by the treatment. And I must say that if we look, if we estimate it and we do that rigorously, there are significant effects, particularly for false news, for false tweets, and not for true tweets. However, the magnitude of them is absolutely minuscule compared to the other effects, and that's what we see in these graphs. So we see essentially that veracity and alignment doesn't change that much between different treatments. So with that, let me remind you why we did all of these several exercises. So we think about the senders, trying to see whether they want to share something on social media. And there are several ways in which the treatments affect it. So first, just in usual cost of sharing, more clicks, or more thinking, more mental costs. Then the treatments affect, and we know that they do significantly, although very little, affect the estimates of veracity and alignment, but also they affect how important the reputation motives is in the sender's decision. So now what we do is we're going to use our estimates in order to predict what would happen hypothetically as a result of our treatments if we only allow one at a time of these three channels, shutting down the other ones, and try to understand what are the lessons from that. And in particular, let me start with allowing only the updating veracity and alignment channel. So now our treatments, the only thing they do, they actually make people change their perception of how true or partisan this content is. And it turns out that it does very little as far as the effects of the treatments are concerned. Let me just spend several seconds describing you what I'm showing you here. I will show you three sets of results like this for each of the channels separately. So on this side, for you on the left-hand side, the results are for the false tweets. On the left-hand sides for the true tweets. In each of the subgraphs, on the right-hand side, just to compare, I show you the overall reduced form effects of each of the interventions. And on the left-hand side, we see what is the simulated effect if we only focus on one of these three channels. So what we see here is actually And that already I anticipated by looking at the fact that veracity and alignment didn't really change that much because of the treatments. We see there's very little effect of that on the overall sharing. And that already gives us one very interesting insight, which is that it turns out to be the case that fact-checking, which surprisingly is supposed to change our perception of whether the content is true or not, is not working because it does affect our estimates of the veracity. If it's working for other reasons. So let's see why. So that's the first channel. The second channel is when we, that's this behavioral channel I was talking about, when we only allow the salience of reputation channel change from one treatment to another. And what we see is that we suddenly see very large effects. In particular, all treatments significantly reduce sharing of false information and significantly increase sharing true information by making the more salient this idea that sharing false information may be damaging for the reputation. And interestingly so, we see particularly large effect of priming fake news circulation on the false tweets, and that's where we see the different effect for false and true tweets. So now, of course, all sharing, all interventions which try to limit misinformation circulation on social media have costs. And we can estimate the effects of this cost and measure this cost directly. And that's what we do in this slide. And indeed, the costs are positive for all interventions, but they are different for different ones. In particular, what we see is that the costs are particularly heavy for offering fact check and for asking to assess tweet content treatments. And it's fairly light for the priming fake news circulation. So that already gives us the idea of why we get the reduced form which we do, which is why the priming fake news circulation is the only treatment which actually increases the circulation of true news. So far the lessons from this analysis is following, that it seems, and it wasn't news to us, but I think, in retrospect, it does make sense that updating effect, it actually is weak. In particular, as I already anticipated, the fact-checking on effect of fact-checking on sharing does not go through making people update veracity. We also see that the salience effect is very, very strong. And it's particularly strong for priming false news circulation and assessing content before sharing, yet the costs of assessing content before sharing are much higher. And that's why essentially this exercise tells us that out of these comparison of these interventions, the priming fake news circulation seems to be most effective so far. Of course, that's because it decreases the sharing of misinformation without affecting sharing through news, or actually encouraging it, which also is quite easy to implement. And when we introduce, and we have plans on introducing platforms, profit functions to this, we're going to see that the platforms will be less affected in terms of this when this intervention is implemented. At the same time, of course, one needs to think about whether this is a scalable intervention. With all sort of behavioral interventions like priming anything, at some point people may stop paying attention to them. And finally, let me just skip the methodological contribution, especially given that we need to think a lot more about how we model it and whether we can get some more insights from this exercise. We have a huge future plans on extending it in all sorts of different directions, and some are kind of fairly obvious, like we can change the share of informed And that would basically help us simulate the digital literacy campaign, but we're going to also try to, this is also partial equilibrium. So we're going to try to make it more general, introduce a set of senders, set of receivers, and the receivers will actually also be senders of passing on that information. And we're going to try to use that in order to simulate the more serious interventions like regulation of social media. So let me stop here and see if there is
Great.
any
Thank you.
time for your
Yeah,
questions.
we have time for questions. So
Hey, Kathy, thank you. This is super interesting. I have two questions, very quick. The first one is, do you think the results may be affected by the fact that those two tweets that are false, many people may perceive this as blatantly false? I know the US, all sort of things can happen, and even, condom could be one day made illegal, but as of today, I think most people that look at those two tweets, it's the probability they are false and they shouldn't even bother fact checking, maybe it's very high. I was wondering if you had two tweets there cast a doubt about, okay, what is this, true or false? It's like, what's going on? And the second one is, you have the ideology of each individual user, because I'm guessing that the reputational concern of me sharing something that is false maybe stronger for people that are more moderate or they are a more diverse set of followers, while people that are very extreme, maybe, they balance this concern about, I want to, show that I'm very extreme, even if at the risk of, this being false. I just wonder, since you have the data, why not?
Yeah, so both excellent questions. So on the first one, I would like to draw on the literature which already exists, which studies these policies one by one, which makes me think that actually, all our results as far as the effect of these policies on false tweets are pretty general. So these have been replicated in different contexts, but they are very specific and never compared to each other. So we are, I believe we're the first ones which put it in the same experiment, but we do see that exactly the same things were shown on our previous work with Sergey and Pennycook's work. And so I don't think that's a big concern to us. What is, so here I would like to highlight the novel part from how I understand it, which is that we also look at true, and that has not been done to the best of my knowledge. So I don't think that's a particular concern. So then your wonderful question about the ideology, we of course have the ideology, and we still need to look a lot closer at the heterogeneity, and we're going to do that for sure. So far, I can tell you several things that I think, from what I remember when I was looking at this, you're absolutely right that the more strongly, ideologically aligned people have a lower threshold on how, on veracity when they share the information. That's first thing. Second thing, we also, and that you might want to kind of, you will be interested maybe in this factoid, that we see that Democrats on average are much more informed than Republicans, but it seems that both Democrats and Republicans are, to the same extent, are willing to forego some of the reputation effects in order to achieve persuasion. So that's what we see. That to start with, maybe because of my ideological biases, or I don't know why, thought that Democrats would do it less than Republicans. That's not true. So we don't find that. So that kind of heterogeneity is not there, but look, it's all pretty fresh, and we're gonna try to be very systematic in the set of the heterogeneity exercises which we do, and I don't have that results here.
So this is fascinating. And so just to summarize the way I understand it, if you ask me to send something I know it's true, but I need to show I know it's true, then I will refrain from doing that, right? Just telling me, how do you assess this to be true? Means I know it's wrong and I need to affirm it's wrong before sending, and then I send it less, right? So that's the way you make this cost salient of sending wrong information.
Okay, let me say there are two things. Which, like there are two interventions. Let me be precise, and I'm sorry that was really
there are many, but
fast.
basically that's the way I understand the cost.
One intervention. Just I'll let you ask the question. So, but just let me clarify. One intervention is a general priming, saying, okay, hey, there's a lot of circulation of misinformation and maybe costly. Think about what you're doing, without any content-specific references. The other intervention, which is first think about assessing what the partisanship and veracity of this. Yes, that's very costly, unlike the priming.
So my question, exactly. That's what changes everything. So my question is, why doesn't the market do the same? You have media that emerge that make a lot of money by selling fake news. So how comes that it's enough to prime the fact that these media may tell you lies, and yet you buy news from them? That's the puzzle to me.
Well, I have to think more about how I could answer that within this setting, but obviously there's a huge literature on sort of cognitive dissonance, on preference-based news consumption, on people consuming information which is partisan, which so far is completely outside our setting. I think in principle we could try to generalize it and try to understand whether we could, even model, let's say, sort of the homophilic groups. If we will, it will require a lot of assumptions, but generally, I think that the reason why there's no overall market effects of that is precisely because people like to consume information which is in line with their partisan priors, let's say, and they have cost of learning something which makes them change their mind. So far, I haven't said anything in the model about that, though. So, it's not a super great answer, but I think that's at least partly correct.
Okay. So was there another, a question behind me or? Oh, thanks. Sorry.
Right. Thank you. I was wondering if you could introduce in your model the reaction of people's neighbors on Twitter, for example, the followers. If someone talks, reacts to what I'm saying all the time, this person becomes part of my audience. And the weight of this person on my reactions, my calculations, my etc., could be factored in. And that includes that. And when you start doing this, you could add 1, 2, 3 neighbors and start looking at the network of your entourage. And this could change the way you actually think about the equilibrium or the non-equilibrium. Sorry.
So that's another excellent question. And indeed, so far, we have been really partial. So we have one sender and persuading receivers, but generally, so our ambition is the following. So maybe it's not about reactions, but it's very much in line with your suggestion. What we would like to understand is that we want to consider a society of people who are somehow connected on social media, and every share does two things. One is that changes the perceptions about the state of the world, but it also affects what people pass on social media, and then that it could actually come back to you through the network. So that will allow us to try to understand sort of the effects like echo chambers, filter bubbles, things like this. But you know, that's really hypothetical. So far, what I'm telling you here is just a pure cheap talk because we haven't managed to model it yet. So we will try, and I don't know what will happen.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's great and really interesting. And as you said, I really like the way it's synthesizing and pulling together a bunch of results from literature because it feels very consistent and with prior work, but also extending it. So it's great. Two thoughts. One, it seems to me like the way the fact checking is included in the experiments is somewhat different than the way it's often implemented on the platform in ways that could matter. So one, I think in general, the way fact checking is implemented on Facebook and elsewhere, it doesn't really impact the sharing of true news directly at all. It could indirectly by changing people's beliefs, but you don't, on Facebook, you don't, when you are about to share a true piece of content, you are not prompted for whether you would like to see a fact check for a false piece of content. And then also, I think a lot of the main way that fact checking is implemented is that it just affects the frequency with which things are shown to people and leads to downranking. So I'm not sure how much this cost thing is going to be applicable, or it would be good to think about how that generalizes. And then the other thing is just a comment for in thinking about ongoing work on this. I think things that would be really neat to separate these different theoretical mechanisms, the ones that are in the model and also some of the other ones we were talking about. One is varying the audience, how if we can think about an experimental design where we can vary explicitly who you think you're sharing to, and because this persuasion motive is going to be very different depending on what you think people's existing beliefs are. You don't really need to persuade people if they're already on your side, and so on. And the other thing I've always wished somebody would do, maybe they have and I missed it, but is, you know, how different does this look if the sharing is anonymous? So you can choose to share something not with your name attached to it on your Twitter feed, but through you know, some other channel where it's not going to be attached to your name, because these motives like persuasion and also just kind of altruism, like I just want to share stuff that I think is going to be helpful to people, have nothing to do with my name being attached to it, whereas these reputation motives really do. And I think that would be a nice contrast to see.
Absolutely, thank you very much. And I would like to say that you're absolutely right, that this is a very important limitation of our setup, that people are asked to share something when they are at the same time shown fact check of a particular subset of this news, and that may not be that real. Yeah, we're gonna need to acknowledge it. I don't think we can do much about that at this point, apart from maybe trying to do it differently in the follow-up. For the other things, well taken. So we will try to see whether we can do it in the subsequent experiments. As far as the anonymous sharing is concerned, I would like to say that it, you know, the one thing which seems to be probably likely as a hypothesis is that people are also much less persuaded by, you know, content which they can't trace to some kind of a source, although sometimes you could make the source appear as credible. So, but you're absolutely right that this is important parts of this big sharing decision, which we completely didn't model so far. Well, thank you very much for the excellent comments. It's really timely.
Thank you very much. We have two questions from the audience who's following online. So the first one is, would the fact check be less effective if the number of circulations of the fake news is high? And the second one is, would you think that people are more concerned about veracity when it comes to the economy rather than to legal political matters or a bill being passed?
Do you repeat the second one? Sorry.
Yes, sorry.
Topic of English. Yeah. Yeah. So I have to be academically sort of honest, and I should say that I don't know the answers to either of these questions. At the same time, I can probably speculate that when the circulation, there's a lot of circulation of false news that would actually increase relatively, that would be my hypothesis, the effectiveness of the fact checking, because you can actually screen those which are, well, no, you can't screen. So yeah, because usually, like, to the extent that fact check only applies to the false news, probably that would be less effective. You're absolutely right. Thank you for pointing that out. At the same time, if that's the case, then we can think about the different type of, theoretically different type of intervention, which is flagging those which are true. So I mean, in a sense, like the mirror opposite of this fact-checking information, which probably will be more effective in that setup. So, and as far as the topic of the tweets, I don't know, with one caveat that actually, if we see the average sharing of among these 4 tweets which we studied, we see that there was a lot more sharing of one economic tweet, which was on debt relief, which was true, and one cultural tweet on condoms. So it's at least with the set of 4 pieces of news, I don't really see any systematic pattern here.